Hi everyone, I've painted two fairly simple paintings that I thought you could use to put on some Christmas cards. In this video I'll demonstrate how I painted the baubles, and in the second video, part 2, I demonstrate how I painted the Santa. I've transferred the drawing of the baubles onto some cold press arch paper. You don't need to use cold press paper, you can use hot press paper if you'd prefer. I'm going to pick up some watery Windsor lemon, and I'm just going to paint that onto the bauble on the right here. So this is the green one. I'm just painting on the dry paper with my number 11 round Betty Hayways brush. So just using the watery Windsor lemon, and you don't have to use Windsor lemon either, you can use any bright yellow. So just paint that onto the dry paper. I'll be just painting around the ribbon that overlaps the baubles, but if you find that it's too difficult to do that, you can always use some masking fluid and just mask out the ribbon, and then you can just paint over the top of it. I don't very often use masking fluid myself. I do have some, but I think that the fluid that I have is getting old, because the last time I used it, when I took it off, it had discoloured the paper. So I won't be using it on this painting. Okay, so now that that's covered, I need to dry that off with a hairdryer. So I've dried it off with the hairdryer. Now I'm re-wetting it with water because I want to work on the damp paper now. Now the yellow will act as an underwash underneath the green, and it will just give the green a bit of a glow. So that's why I've put the yellow there. So I'm just re-wetting the surface with water, so that I can put some green over the top and work wet on wet. So make sure there's nice even coverage over the surface and that there's no puddles sitting anywhere. Okay, so I'm going to use just some watery sap green now. So I paint that onto the damp paper. And I just have to be careful around the edges, just so that I don't make the bauble misshapen in any way. So I'm just painting this layer of sap green over the top of the yellow. And the reason I dampened the paper was because this is a fairly large bauble, and I have to be careful around the ribbon and around the edges of the bauble so that I don't make the bauble misshapen or anything like that. And this water on the paper just gives me more time to do that. I don't have to worry about hard edges forming in my paint. Okay, so just finishing off this section, and then I'm just going to paint the little sections that are hidden beneath the ribbon. And I can do that on the dry paper because there are only tiny little sections here. So to paint these sections, I've switched down to a smaller round brush. I think this is a number 5 that I'm using at the moment. The other one was just too large to get in there. Okay, so I've completely dried that with my hairdryer. Now I want to darken this left-hand side. So I want to work on damp paper again, so I'm just painting some water on. Now you need to make sure that your paint is completely dry before you do this, or you'll get into all sorts of messes. So I'm just going to paint the water over that entire section above the ribbon there. So once it's completely covered with water, that top section, I'm just going to put some more sap green now, just on this left-hand side of the bauble. So this is slightly darker than that first layer that I painted, so I've mixed a bit more pigment into the mix. I'm not going to paint the whole bauble with this, I just want to keep this darker paint on the left-hand side because this is the darker side. And like before, I want to paint on the damp paper because I want soft edges on my paint. I don't want to see any hard lines forming. So I've taken the paint just past the halfway point, so the darker paint just runs down here. And this little section down here I can just paint on the dry paper because I'm just filling it completely in. So now I've got some more sap green, so it's even darker, and I'm just keeping this on the left hand side. The paper is still damp from when I put that darker layer just a moment ago. It hasn't dried yet. And that first darker layer that I painted comes across to about here. Now I've finished the paint in a curved shape along there. I haven't taken it straight down. It's sort of on a curve. And this darker paint just comes in this area here. So I'm just going to let that dry completely. And while it does, I'll paint this inner section of this red bauble. Now this one I want to paint on damp paper because it's very, very hot here today and I've got a fan going on above me. And I'm just a bit worried that the paint will dry too quickly before I finish it. So this one's got the ribbon that's falling over the top of it, and I've got to manipulate the brush in and around that ribbon. So this will just give me a bit more time if the paper's damp. So I'll just focus on that inner section of the bauble between the two sections of ribbon. I won't worry about these outer parts just yet. So on this bauble I'm going to use some Scarlet Lake. So this is a Winsor & Newton colour, and I use a watery mix of it. I just paint it straight onto the damp paper. I've got a smaller brush now, just so that I can get in and around that ribbon. So you can see that the water on the paper just makes it easier and quicker to put the paint on. And I don't get any of those hard edges forming. Okay, so just a light coverage of that Scarlet Lake over the top. Okay, so now I can paint these sections on the side here, and I'm just going to paint these on the dry paper because it just butts up against the ribbon there and it's just a small section. I don't have to worry about edges forming in my paint. I'll just do that section over there. Okay, now I need to dry this again with my hairdryer. So that's all dry. Now I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the other one. I just want to dampen this section in the middle, just with some water. And again, you need to make sure that your paint's completely dry before you do this. Okay, so that whole section in the middle is now damp with water. I won't worry about the side section just yet, this area here. I'll leave that till later. So now I want to pick up some paint from the top of the palette. So I rub my wet brush over the paint where I've squirted it out to get that dark pigment. So instead of using the watery paint, I'll use this darker paint. And again, I want to keep it to the left-hand side of the bauble. So I've just picked up some more paint there by wiping my brush over the pigment. Now the pigment in my palette has gone hard as well. It's been there for a while and it's hardened, so it's not soft and sticky. So I keep this darker paint to the left-hand side. Pull it across, just on the damp paper. Again, I try and get that curve in the paint so that it's not straight up and down. So I'm following the shape of the bauble with my strokes. And as I move across, there's less paint on my brush so that it gets lighter. So the bulk of the paint is on the left-hand side. I'm just going to take the paint out of my brush and just wipe it on a cloth and just use my damp brush here just to soften any hard edges that might be forming or starting to form. So my brush has got no paint on it at the moment, it's just slightly damp with water. So now I want to go back to this watery paint here and I'll paint in this side because this side is lighter. I don't want that heavy pigment on this side. And because this side is the dark side, I've picked up the paint again from the top of the palette. So I've wiped my wet brush over that dark pigment at the top. And that gives me that dark colour. So all of this has just been the one colour, which is Scarlet Lake. Now coming back over to this green bauble, it has dried completely. So now what I'm doing is I'm painting a wash of the Winsor Lemon over the top of the right hand side. So over the top of the lighter side, just to brighten it up. I can do this on the dry paper because the transparent lemon is very pale and you can't see where it starts and finishes on top of that dark green paint. So back over to this one. I'm just doing the same thing with the Winsor Lemon. I'm just painting it onto the lighter side of the bauble. It just brightens up that lighter side. So if you find you get a paint line, just use a damp brush just to soften the edge away. Also need to put it into here because this is in the light as well. So just the lemon straight over the top of the dry paint. Okay, both baubles are completely dry. Now it's time to start painting the ribbon. So I'm going to paint a wash of the Winsor Lemon over the top of the entire ribbon. I decided to paint this ribbon green, like the bauble. So I'm just going to paint the lemon underneath, which will give the green a bit of a glow. So you can paint the ribbon on the dry paper. Just use a small round brush and let it dry. While I wait, I'll paint this top of this bauble in here with the lemon as well, the Winsor Lemon. Now I'm mixing some sap green here with some French ultramarine. I just want to darken the left-hand side of the green bauble even further. As it's dried, I've looked at it and I thought, no, I want that to be slightly darker. So if I mix a bit of the French ultramarine into that sap green, that'll give me a slightly darker colour here. So again, I just want to paint on the damp paper. So I'm just wetting the bauble. I don't need to take the paint all the way across, so I'm not going to wet the entire bauble. So now I've got that mix that I just mixed up with the two colours. I'm just dotting it onto this left-hand side. So I'm keeping it within the water's edge so that I don't get hard edges forming. A little bit down in there as well. Just make sure that your paint is dry before you start doing this. So just a little bit more now. And now I need to get rid of that edge there. Because it's so hot today, the paper's drying really quickly. So just use a damp brush here and that just gets rid of that edge. So that paint is still damp. I'm just dropping in some French ultramarine just on its own now, just on this left-hand side. I'm just patting the brush onto the damp paper. Just to darken up that left-hand side. So back over to the ribbon now, and I'm just painting a layer of the sap green, so watery sap green, over the top of the dry Winsor Lemon. And I want to paint this all over the ribbon. So just use a small round brush and just paint as carefully as I can. As I paint, I flatten out the bristles so that I'm not just using the tip of the brush. That gives me those nice straight edges. So that's all covered with a layer of sap green now. I've just painted this little section in here too that I missed. So now I want to use some quinacridone fuchsia. Now this is a Daniel Smith colour. It's like a burgundy. I just want to darken up this left hand side of the red bauble. I just feel again that it's not quite dark enough. So I'm just going to use some watery paint. I've mixed quite a bit of pigment into it though. So I want to work on damp paper to do this. Just again because I want soft edges. So I'm just wetting the paper in between the ribbon. So just that section in the middle. And I won't paint this section just yet. I'll leave that for later. So you can see the water on the paper here. There's a nice sheen on the surface, but there's no puddles anywhere. So there's just an even coverage of water all over the paper there. And now I've got the quinacridone fuchsia. As I said, there's a fair amount of pigment mixed into the watery paint. I'm patting it on to the left-hand side. Any sort of burgundy colour will be fine for this. Here I'm just softening the edge with the damp brush, just to make sure it doesn't form a hard line there. And now I can put the paint straight on here onto the dry paper on this left-hand side. So I'm just glazing one colour over the top of the other. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'll just fix up underneath the ribbon here, just make sure it's got a nice clean edge on it. And now I want to start painting the ribbon again. Now I need to dry that bauble off. I'm going to use a smaller brush this time. I have been using a number 5 round brush. Now I want to switch down to a smaller one, to a number 3, just to give me a bit more control when I paint the ribbon. So I'm going to use sap green again, this time slightly darker than when I put the first wash on. And I'm just going to pull it in from the edge towards the middle of each section. So I'm just painting on the dry paper. And now I use my damp brush to soften the paint edge. So make sure your brush is only damp. If you try to soften a paint edge with a wet brush, you end up just putting more water on the paper for the paint to flow into. And also if your brush is too dry, it won't do anything. So it just needs to be damp. Damp enough that it softens the paint edge, but not too wet, because if it's too wet, it'll put a puddle of water on your paper. So sap green, pulling it from the edge down towards the middle of this section of ribbon. And then I take my damp brush, I clean the paint out of my brush, and then dry it on the cloth, and then use it to soften the paint edge. Just so you disguise the area where one colour meets the other, or one colour value meets the other colour value. So I put the dark paint on, and then I soften my edge with the damp brush. I have made a technique video about watercolour paint edges. I demonstrate how to soften paint edges in more detail. If you haven't seen it and you're not sure how to do it, I'll leave a link to that video in the description of this one. So I'm just softening the edge again there. So I put the paint on, then I wash out my brush, take off the excess moisture, and then use it to soften the paint edge. Just want to darken in here as well. So this is all just sap green that I'm using. just soften the edge again, just with the damp brush. And I need a little bit more colour over here as well. Soften the edge again. Okay, so that's all dry. I've dried it with the hairdryer. Now I have a 1/4" silver scrubber oval filbert brush. Now this is just a stiff brush that I'm going to use to remove some paint in the highlighted section. So the brush is damp, but the paper is dry. Make sure your paper's dry or you'll end up creating watercolour blooms. So I just use the damp brush just to gently rub at the paper in that highlighted area between the two darker areas that I've just painted on each segment. Now I keep dampening the brush, so I put it into the water and then just dab off the excess, and then I touch my paper with it. And I'm just being very gentle with the brush. This is a very abrasive brush. I don't want to damage the paper. So just give it a little scrub and then I can use a tissue to take the paint off. So back here I need to darken this area with the sap green again. So to get the paint darker, you just mix a bit more pigment into the watery mix, just to make it darker. And I just use a damp brush to soften the edge again. So up here on the curved part of the ribbon, put the dark paint, pull it where I want it, and then when I take it as far as I want it, I can just use a damp brush just to take away that hard edge. And this gives the ribbon form. So where the light is shining on it, you get those lighter spots. And then where it's in shadow, you've got the darker spots. So I'm just looking at the reference photo as I do this, and I'm looking for the darker areas on the ribbon. I just take the paint as far as I think, and then to get rid of the edge where the dark paint finishes, so you don't notice it so much, a damp brush will rub it away. Just pulling a little bit down from the top here. Leave the bottom section lighter and soften that edge again. And you can see just by looking at the lights and the darks, how that just creates all those waves and curl in the ribbon. So the darker pigment here. A little bit more paint. And then I'll soften that edge. So the darker paint. Taking my time, I'm not rushing. So just have patience with it as you paint. The whole area in there can be darker. I'll put a little bit from the tip back. Soften the edge. So now I just want a bit more paint on this area here. So just the sap green on the dry paper. So the darker paint in the curve, pull it back, and then use your damp brush to soften the edge. Just put a bit more here. So again, I dried it off with the hairdryer. Now I'm using the scrubber brush the same way, just rubbing over the highlighted section to make it slightly lighter. And then I can use a tissue just to dab off the paint. You must make sure that your ribbon is dry before you do this. So the brush is damp and the paper is dry. And you don't need to use this particular scrubber brush. Any stiff bristle brush will do the same thing. Just any brush with really stiff bristles. Okay, I'm just going to use my little 00 Da Vinci Maestro brush. Just one section of the ribbon, just down here. I can still see my pencil line. So I just want to put just a bit of darker paint there just to disguise it. So again, I'm just using the sap green, but it's darker this time. I won't be able to rub that off with my eraser because it's got a few layers of paint on it. So this paint will just disguise it. I've got a larger version of that scrubber brush that I was using. This is a 1/2 inch brush, I think. And I just want to do the same thing on the baubles themselves, just to create a highlight on the lighter section. So again, the paper's dry, the brush is damp, and I use a tissue just to take off the excess paint. And I'm trying not to press too heavily, I don't want to damage the paper. Okay, so once I've removed the highlight, to get rid of this hard edge around the outer perimeter, I can use a wet brush and just paint some water over the highlight, just around the edges and on the highlight itself. And that just lifts a small amount of pigment and redistributes it. And it just softens away that hard edge there. So just a little bit of water there. I'm going to do the same thing on the red one. So a damp bristle brush, gently rubbing, and then dabbing with a tissue to take the paint off. And then when you get it the way you want it, just get a wet brush again, just with water, and rub over it, just to soften away those hard edges. I'm just painting the Winsor Lemon on the top of this one. And now I've got some sepia here and I'm darkening the left-hand side again. So here I'm painting on the dry paper with some watery sepia. Just pulling it across. I'm going to keep the right side light. I'm not going to put any paint over there. Just softening the edge there with a damp brush. Now I've got some more pigment, so I've picked it up from the top of the palette here. Now that first layer of sepia is still damp. Now I'm using my liner brush just to tidy up the edges. So this is a little 00 Maestro. Just running it over that little top arch. I'll do the same thing on this one. Just the watery sepia first on the left-hand side, pulling it across. This is my number 3 Betty Hayways brush, so the smaller round brush. So it's watery sepia. Now I've switched down to my smaller liner brush. I've got some more sepia, but this time it's darker. And that first layer of sepia is still damp. Little section on the top there that I'll paint in. Run it around the edge. Just want to define this edge a bit better up here. Now I'm going just a bit darker at the top here, so there's more pigment. And again, the paper's still damp from that first layer of paint. So now I want to paint a shadow just to ground the baubles so they don't look like they're floating in the air. You don't have to put this on if you don't want to. So I'm just drawing it where I want to put it, and then I'm going to use a grey that I like to mix up. I think I'll take this one all the way across to the other side. So I'm going to mix my grey that I like to mix. This is French Ultramarine, and I'll use some burnt sienna just to grey it down. So this longer shadow here, I just want to paint on the damp paper because I want it to have soft edges on either side. So I've just put a bit of water there where the shadow sits. And then I just drop that grey paint on that I've just mixed. It gives me those little soft fuzzy edges. These ones here can have hard edges, so I can paint them on the dry paper. I've mixed a bit of water into the grey so that it's not too dark. So just painting on the dry paper here and over here as well. That gives me the chance to tidy up that bottom edge there where I got a bit of red paint on the white paper. And the other thing I want to do is just darken the shadow where it's closer to the bauble. So I'm just going to put a bit more paint while it's still damp, and I'll just darken the area that's closest to the bauble. So I'm just dotting that onto the damp paint. Okay, so I dried it off really well with my hairdryer, and now I'm just rubbing over any pencil lines that might still be showing. I'm just going to use a tiny bit of white ink. This is Winsor & Newton white ink, and my liner brush just along the edges of the ribbon in places. So I'm just using the brush right up on its tip. I dip the brush down into the ink well. You can use white gouache to do this instead of the white ink if you don't have it. And if you don't want to do it, you don't need to, it's not necessary. Just gives the ribbon a little edge. If you can't get a really fine line when you do this, then just don't bother doing it. It won't really make that much difference. a little bit up there. Okay, so there's my finished Christmas decoration painting. So in the next video, part 2, I'll show you how I painted this little Santa.